I used to think that getting old was the worst thing that could happen to a person. Then I became old, and I found out I was wrong about almost everything. My name is Margaret, and I am 94 years old, and I want to tell you something that took me most of my life to understand. I was born in 1931 in a small house outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, the third of 6 children, which meant that from the very beginning I was practiced at being overlooked, not in a cruel way. My parents were good people who were simply outnumbered. But when you grow up in the middle of a crowd, you spend a lot of years trying to figure out what makes you distinct, what makes you worth noticing, and that question can follow you all the way into adulthood if you let it. When I was 22, I married a man named Howard. He was tall and patient, and he laughed at things other people didn't think were funny, which I always considered a sign of real intelligence. We had 41 years together before he passed, and I will tell you honestly that not all of those years were easy. There were stretches of time where we were more like 2 people sharing a roof than 2 people sharing a life. That happens in long marriages. Nobody tells you that before you get into one. They show you the flowers and the dancing and the dress, and they forget to mention that love, real love, is mostly just deciding to come back to the same table every morning, even when you'd rather not. I came back to that table more mornings than I can count, and so did he, and somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary showing up, we built something that I did not have a name for until he was gone, and I felt the shape of it in his absence. I would call it a life, but that sounds too small. It was more like a world. And when he died, I had to learn how to live without the gravity of it. That was 1994. I was 69 years old, and I thought I was finished. I thought the significant part of my story had ended, and that whatever came after was just a kind of waiting. I moved into a smaller house. I kept his chair by the window. I watched my children grow older and have children of their own, and I smiled at the right moments. And I was present, but I was not really there. I had decided, without quite knowing I had decided it, that my life had already happened. What I did not expect was my neighbor, Dottie. Dottie moved in next door in 1997. She was 73 and recently retired, and she had the kind of energy that made you tired just watching her, but in a way that also made you want to sit up a little straighter. She knocked on my door one Tuesday morning and asked if I wanted to come to a watercolor class with her at the community center, and I said no, because I was not an artistic person, and I had never painted anything in my life, and I was 72 years old, and it seemed like a strange time to start. She came back the next Tuesday and asked again. I said no again. She came back the Tuesday after that, and I don't know if it was stubbornness on her part or loneliness on mine, but I put on my coat and I went. I was terrible at it, genuinely terrible. My water and my color never cooperated, and the instructor, a kind young woman who was probably 30, kept coming over to gently redirect what I was doing. And I sat there the first day feeling foolish and old and out of place, and then something shifted. I don't know exactly when. I was trying to paint a simple thing, just a window with light coming through it, something I had seen that morning in my kitchen, and I looked down at what I had made, and it was wrong. It was nothing like what I intended, but there was something in it that was mine, something I had put there that had not existed before I put it there. And for the first time in 3 years, I felt like I was still a person who was capable of making something. I kept going to that class every Tuesday for 11 years. I never became a good painter, and I made peace with that early. But what I found in those rooms, in those hours, was something I had not realized I was missing. The feeling of being a beginner, of not knowing what I was doing, of having permission to make something imperfect and call it an afternoon well spent. When you are young, being a beginner feels like a problem to solve. When you are old, if you are lucky, you learn that being a beginner is one of the last great freedoms available to you. I think about that a lot now. I think about how much of my life I spent trying to appear as though I already knew things, competent, capable, certain. When my children were small, I did not want them to see me uncertain. When I was working, I did not want my colleagues to see me uncertain. Even with Howard, there were whole parts of myself I kept managed and composed because I thought that was what it meant to be a steady person, a reliable person, a person others could count on. And maybe some of that was necessary, but I gave up something in the process. I gave up the particular kind of intimacy that comes from letting someone see you try something and fail at it and try again. I was so busy being dependable that I sometimes forgot to be real. My granddaughter called me last spring. She is 31 and she is in the middle of a life that has more moving parts than she knows what to do with, a demanding job and a young marriage and a baby on the way. And she called me because she was tired, deeply tired in the way that has nothing to do with sleep. And she said, "Grandma, I feel like I'm doing everything right and still somehow missing something, and I don't know what it is." And I sat with that for a moment before I said anything because I recognized that feeling. I recognized it the way you recognize the face of someone you knew a long time ago in a crowd. I told her that I thought the missing feeling wasn't a sign that something was wrong. I told her that I thought it was the feeling of a life that is too full of performance and not full enough of presence. That there is a difference between doing your life and living it. And that difference is almost impossible to feel when you are in the middle of everything. It takes distance. It takes years. Sometimes it takes losing someone or something so important that the space they leave behind finally gives you room to see clearly. She asked me if it got easier, and I said yes and no, which is the most honest answer I have ever given to anything. What changes, I told her, is not that the hard things become less hard. What changes is that you become less afraid of hard things. Somewhere in your 70s, if you are paying any attention at all, you stop spending energy on the fear of difficulty and you start spending it on the actual difficulty itself. And that shift turns out to make an enormous difference. You become more efficient with yourself, less wasteful of your own hours. You start to understand that most of the suffering you did in your 30s and 40s was not about the things that were actually happening. It was about the stories you were telling yourself about what those things meant about you, about your worth, about whether you were going to be okay. And you were always going to be okay. Not because everything worked out, it didn't always, but because okay is something you carry with you, not something that happens to you. I have outlived Howard and Dottie and my younger brother James and more friends than I can count, and I have sat with enough endings to understand that there is nothing on the other side of loss except more life, asking you to show up for it. And that sounds hard, because it is hard. But there is something clarifying about it, too. When you have lost enough, you stop being precious about the time that remains. You stop saving things for special occasions. You stop waiting to feel ready before you begin. You understand in your bones that this is the occasion, and you are as ready as you will ever be, and the only thing left to do is to use the afternoon. I am 94 years old, and most mornings I sit by the window that I once tried to paint, the one with the light coming through, and I drink my coffee and I watch the neighborhood wake up. And I feel something that I would not have had the vocabulary for when I was young. It is not happiness exactly, though I am often happy. It is more like a deep okayness with the shape of things, with the fact that life is long and short simultaneously, that it holds more than you expect and less than you hope, that the people you love will leave before you are finished loving them, and that you will leave before the people who love you are finished either, and that none of that cancels out the value of any of it. If you are young and you are busy and you are in the middle of a chapter that feels like it is pulling you in 17 directions at once, I want you to hear this not as advice but as a report from somewhere further along the road. You do not need to have it figured out. The figuring out is the life, and the things you think are interruptions, the detours, the Tuesday mornings where you put on your coat and go somewhere you weren't planning, those are usually the things you will remember longest when the rest of it has faded. I went to a watercolor class because a stubborn woman knocked on my door 3 weeks in a row, and it gave me back something I didn't know I'd lost. That's the whole story, really. Most of the good things in my life came in sideways. I suspect yours will too.